Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 18 of Series 8. The question for today is, can the origins of value be found in the structures of consciousness? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 10. Our wider objective here is to grasp human existence as consciousness and resolve problems in terms of value. Simply put, my hypothesis advocates the affirmation or will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. So much of my thinking is directed to understanding the character of consciousness and value. And today we will discuss the origins of value explained in the structures of consciousness. We must do this because every subject needs a basis or foundation in which it can be grounded and understood. Mathematics, for example, couldn't be grounded in psychology, but was seen as an aspect of logic or set theory. Science has been thought of at times in crisis by relying on contingent empirical observations. Value theory is even more ephemeral and needs some sort of foundation. This is why I'm presenting consciousness as a basis for value and for values. In order to do this, we need to define value, although I have already defined value extensively in other workshops. Yet we can first define value using my typology of consciousness, cognition, affect, will, and value. So value could be contrasted to cognition, affect, and will, although it is also a part of these states. Academic and existential accounts, for example, attribute value with high volitional content. Another feature of value is that it is a subjective state of consciousness, not some quasi-objective entity. Evidence for the subjectivity of value is found in Mackie's argument that there are no objective values. Yet in itself, that this does not mean that values cannot be universal or normative. And another common misunderstanding is to think of value as a synonym for good. But there are many states that are values like desire, wanting, love, hate, morals, aesthetics, and bias. Yet this poses a problem of the diversity or even of the possible incoherence of values. And we must ask if these different states are all masquerading as one concept. And if they are so diverse, can they have the same foundation? To clarify these, I have adopted three classes of perspectival, affective, and motivational or moral values. Yet perspectival values don't even seem to have subjective experiential content. Numerical and truth values only seem to be values analogously and might not qualify as values. This is why I define what I call value more specifically with the features of subjectivity, selection, choice, preference, quality, qualia, intentionality, and phenomenality. And I want to show that these features could all have the same foundation in consciousness. But there are many different origins of value that can be described as valid, invalid, or justifiable. For example, origins might include God, society, reason, authority, genetics, neurology, sociobiology, and choice. Yet valid origins of value correctly describe how values emerge in the world. Invalid origins are simply mistaken or false theories of value. The justifiability of value is a larger issue that concerns Hume's is-or distinction. We discussed justification in our last series 7, so we won't be discussing it again here. Yet just understanding the origins of value gives us an idea of how it might be justified. In my view, one invalid theory of the origins of value is value monism, or like panpsychism, value is everywhere. Hegel's notion of an absolute spirit working itself through the world inspired such a value monism. Or McTaggart and Timothy Sprigg regarded reality and value as constituted by a community of minds. And on this view, reality is a totality of experience, and the experience of everything in it is of value. But this view faces intractable problems like the fact-value distinction and the intrinsic value of objects. And as Mackie might ask, how can physical objects host subjective values? Yet God, reason, and authority can also be described as invalid origins of value, not only because God might not exist, but because, as Kant held, God is an inadequate foundation for ethical theory. Kant attempted to use reason as a foundation, but arguably reason can't sustain value, and authority can also lack adequate reason, as in trust me or believe because I say so. These origins of value can be invalid because they depend on processes of reason or belief. The relation of fact and reason with value is complex and arguable, but we can make a few points here. The argument often takes place within the confines of the cognitive non-cognitive debate. Cognitivists think that feeling is blind and cannot guide action. Non-cognitivists think that thought is impotent and cannot motivate action. The cognitivist and rationalist view, represented by Kant, is that a conception or conceptions alone can establish moral value. Descartes similarly believed in a proof of God's existence on the clarity of the idea of God in the mind. Conversely, David Hume regarded reason as the slave of the passions, or a means to an end, motivated by desire. We can consider, for example, if the motivation to eat an apple that derives from desire or from the conception of the apple. An explanation from desire is compelling here, but moral issues are more complex. But less contentiously, some origins of value are valid because they explain how values are actually produced. For example, social or genetic accounts explain the origins of values that exist and are experienced in the world. But such do not justify these values either as moral principles or as reasons for action. Neither do valid origins, like society, explain the origin of values as mental states. Values are fundamentally mental states of people, not social relations. And the subjectivity of value calls for another approach that I argue for shortly. Explaining such origins of value can be compared to Chalmers' hard problem of explaining consciousness. That is, after all the preconditions have been explained, we still need to explain how the state emerges. And that will have to be done shortly in terms of mental states and consciousness. But I first want to discuss further valid but limited explanations of value. Peter Berger provides such a valid socio-psychological explanation of how moral values are constructed. Step 1, there is an agreement or consensus of what constitutes good behaviour about murder, theft and actions like that. 2, then there is a social objectification of this agreement as an aspect of law, nature or religion. And 3, lastly, the objectified norms are internalised by individuals thereby explaining moral values. Alternatively, Richard Dawkins poses a genetic rule of thumb for tribal life that operates in the modern world. He begins with the view that social groups that help each other will thrive better than those that don't. Social groups with encoded helping behaviour will be more likely to help each other, and that encoded helping behaviour will continue into modern social context. So Dawkins gives us what I call a valid but limited theory of value. For neurological origins, we might turn to Mark Soames, who finds the origins of feeling in the reticular brainstem. He regards feeling and affect states regarded as basic to value as fundamental to consciousness. So even neurology can connect feeling, affect and value states to consciousness. Yet I regard these three arguments as valid but incomplete and needing transitional theories. But what is the nature of the transition from social, genetic or neurological processes to values as mental states? Explanation at these levels incur limitations or gaps by explaining value in terms other than itself. It's like explaining mathematics in terms of psychology, criticised by Frege as psychologism. Or again, it's like Chalmers' hard problem of explaining the emergence of consciousness. That is, explaining consciousness or value in terms of things other than itself, and that is reductionist. In my view, explaining the origins of value in its own terms needs a phenomenology of value and consciousness. And as in phenomenology, I will employ particular structures of consciousness. The structures I employ here are divisibility, graduation, temporality, and intentionality. And in my view, the transition from the physical world to value begins with their shared diversity and divisibility. The physical world presents a mirrored diversity expressed in the origins of consciousness and value. This diversity and divisibility is mirrored in consciousness and value by, for example, Sartre and others. I've recently explained divisibility as an aspect of consciousness in an account of the foundations of mathematics. I hold that divisibility is a feature that applies across the whole spectrum of consciousness. That is, from the separateness of individuals to split brains and a modular theory of mind, to schizophrenia, epistemic contrast and mathematical differentiation by number. But as the following arguments reveal, divisibility can't just be assumed to be a structure of consciousness. John Searle, for example, even names unity as a possible structure of consciousness. Schopenhauer and Feuerbach take this idea of unity to the extremes with the Vedic view that consciousness doesn't depend on individuals who only participate in consciousness. Yet the divisibility of consciousness is endemic and demonstrable, as we shall now show. To begin with, divisibility produces a hiatus and tension within consciousness that is expressed as value. Such can be seen in value such as wanting, or in desire-based theories of value as in Sartre's notion of lack. Another version of this theory is cost theory, that value is a consequence of the price paid. Simply put, we value something more when we pay a higher price for it. Yet more specifically, phenomenologists make a close identification between consciousness and value. Heidegger, for example, cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value, and that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. What is being said here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. And with Sartre, we find an even closer identification between consciousness, value, and choice as selection. He writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose preference, which is an expression of value. Sartre also writes, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. Yet in my view, choice as selection need not be a deliberated choice of reflective consciousness. That is, selection can be a preconscious or an unconscious event of an underlying structure. But Sartre's ultra-phenomenological analysis cannot include such preconscious or unconscious events. This is because he rejects the idea of a graduated conception of consciousness. For example, he writes that it's impossible to conceive of consciousness to the degree to which it's not conscious of itself. For Sartre, consciousness is a plenum of existence because it is pure appearance. So it seems that Sartre can't actually trace selection, choice and value back to their ontological foundation. This is because he not only excludes the unconscious and preconscious from consciousness, he also rejects graduations of consciousness down to subtler and subtler levels. I have argued the case for a graduated conception of consciousness that I can't repeat here, but I can note some thinkers who take this graduated view, who accept this view, such as Darwin, Bernard Williams, Jean Piaget, Henry Price, John Eccles and Teilhard de Chardin. And the graduation of consciousness enables us to trace the origins of selection and value back to its emergence. And we can continue to say that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions as well as to value. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen, it needs a contrast. And such contrasts and divisions in the world are mirrored in the origins of value. A practical illustration of this division, contrast and tension as the basis of value can be found in Nietzsche. Nietzsche had an ambivalent view of Christianity, decrying the religion but praising the person of Christ. He contrasts Christianity to the master morals of heroic cultures that express the will to power. He regards Christianity as the slave morality unable to affirm positive values of life. Nietzsche argued that the weak are unable to achieve or even to aspire to the values of the strong. The values of the weak are thereby those of humility, obedience, suffering, poverty and acceptance. But Nietzsche delivers a twist in his story about the will being repressed and turned against positive values. That is, the will to power is still expressed, but perversely in negative ways. And these negative impulses can't be directed externally, so are redirected inwards towards oneself. This creates classic self-blame, religious guilt, bad conscience or ressentiment, as Nietzsche calls it. But internally directed guilt has another effect of turning human beings into a new kind of creature. The former paradigm was one of I and thou, that of assuming my ways are good, yours are bad. Now guilt opens a fissure within the self, beyond the binary I am good, you are bad, and a new value, a new moral creature is born, held in a tension between guilt and self-interest. But at least two objections can be made to this kind of explanation of the origins of value. One, they are not the values we need for motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. And two, values also emerge from social and biological sources without such selection or choice. In response to social or biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, social or biological explanations are reductionist and need a further level of explanation. For example, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values. They only become values on selection as preferences of mental states. Yet animals are conscious creatures who can have values but not moral values. In response to the first criticism above of explaining only trivial values, we can make a couple of replies. Firstly, that we are explaining the origins of incipient values, not the later motivational and moral values. And secondly, we take this phenomenological analysis further with the structure of temporality. That is, Martin Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Edmund Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. On this view, time is posited as a necessary precondition of consciousness and thereby also of value. Kant's Copernican revolution goes so far as to regard both space and time as produced by consciousness. But we don't need to go so far to make a transition from the world to consciousness and value. Yet we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity of space. Judgments and values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. I look to my left and see a window. I look to my right and see a door. I choose to walk through that door. Outside I find somebody lying on the floor. What do? Help, walk past, or just ignore the person? Now we need recourse to an ethics of value as a development of incipient value. But leaving that ethical project aside, we can return to intentionality to further explain the origins of value. Intentionality is a mental process that intends towards some mental or physical object. It restates the observation that consciousness is conscious of something. Intentionality is usually applied to cognitive states which are constituted by their mental objects. Affective states like pain and pleasure aren't always intentional because they need not involve mental objects. Yet values are invariably intentional because they value some mental object. Describing value as an intentional state has several implications. One, intentionality emphasizes the relation between an internal state and external objects. Two, in the account of value as selection and contrast, the above relation is with the diversity of cognitive objects. And three, internal and external elements imply structure as well as relation, movement, process and difference. These three implications aren't only features of value but also provide an explanation of certain kinds of value. That is, values that are more or less, independent or sufficient, dependent upon an external structure. This is also describing a key aspect of my hypothesis, that is a sufficiency of value. And both intentionality and sufficiency of value can be explained with a metaphor offered by Georges Bataille. Bataille presents us with the metaphor of mind or consciousness as water in a bottle. Intentionality implies a structure of internal and external elements, like a container and its contents. In our own account, the relation is between value states and supportive cognitive frameworks. Our issue is the independence of the value states and the degree of support they require. I previously described this independence as a sufficiency of value. In the language of the metaphor, the liquid in the container can represent mental states of different viscosities. The thicker the liquid or mental state, the more independent it is of external structure. Water will flow all over the place. Hardened cement will hardly need an external structure. Sufficiencies of value will always be somewhere between these extremes. Sufficiencies like moral fortitude, resilience, maturity, self-esteem and courage. But one broad objection to this whole structuralist approach is made by postmodernism. Postmodernists generally oppose phenomenology, as they are post-structuralist or anti-structuralist. That is, they reject the structures posited by phenomenologists, existentialists and others. And with respect to consciousness, postmodernists like Richard Rorty have physicalist inclinations, yet in rejecting the idea of consciousness, they automatically reject any structures of consciousness. Yet Jacques Derrida goes further, attacking the view that finite structure can underlie the whole network of a culture. That is, postmodernism typically rejects the linguistic, social and psychological structures of Saussure, Marx and Freud. But structures of consciousness are not social or psychological constructs. They are conditions of existence. Yet postmodernists also reject such foundations in principle as an unjustifiable preference or privilege. And paradoxically, postmodernists do make claims about mind that they use instead of destabilizing tools. But from another point of view, such use can be regarded as tacitly endorsing the idea of structure. Gilles Deleuze, for example, describes individuality as a differential forever dividing itself and changing. Deleuze also postulates multiple faculties giving rise to feeling, thought and action. He does this because he wants to undermine the coherence of a unified concept of mind. He writes, for example, that schizophrenia is not only a human fact, but also a possibility for thought. But against Deleuze, multiplicity and schizophrenia can be regarded as aspects of the structure of divisibility. Yet this seems to be part of the weakness of postmodernism. That is, as Habermas claims, it uses concepts and processes that it itself rejects, and it overlooks the foundational phenomena of consciousness and value. The conclusion of this workshop is then that we've explained the origins of value, not with the reductionist and materialist theories of sociology and biology, but with the phenomenological structures of consciousness and value themselves, namely the structures of divisibility, graduation, temporality and intentionality. Divisibility is a structure of consciousness that explains how value is produced by contrast and affirmation. Graduation enables us to understand how states like value step down into subtler and subtler levels. Temporality explains how values develop by moving through time as well as space. Intentionality explains how value is related to the world of objects, and these structures can help to explain the key feature of value sufficiency. Yet before that, we defined value using my typology of consciousness as cognition, affect, will and value. Then value could be contrasted to cognition, affect and will, although all these states are in fact mixed. Yet more specifically, we define value with the features of subjectivity, selection, choice, preference, quality, intentionality and phenomenality. Also important were social and biological accounts of the origins of value. These accounts were valid but limited because they didn't explain value in its own terms as consciousness. This is because they left an explanatory gap similar to Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. Finally then, value is a state of consciousness that needs to be understood in terms of consciousness, and given that perspective we can understand both the origins and culminating objective of value. That is the affirmation or will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. Next week we'll look at further explanations in terms of structures of consciousness. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.